Author event, Amy Auscherman, Herman Miller, A Way of Living.
Thanks for coming. Oh, we've got such a wonderful audience tonight. I really appreciate it. We were keeping our close eye on the weather forecast, and we're good until midnight in terms of snow, so just so good to see you. Obviously, there are a lot of design fans and mid-century modern fans and Herman Miller fans, so just so good to see you this evening. Thank you so much for coming. We're here to talk about Herman Miller, this West Coast-based company that's been around for well over a century. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but this is such an iconic and important and influential company that specializes in home furnishings and furniture. Basically, Herman Miller credited with things like inventing the office cubicle and some of these iconic pieces of furniture that we all know, the Noguchi table and the Eames chair, all come from Herman Miller. And I just thought, having read about this book that came out, about 6-7 months or so ago, Herman Miller, A Way of Living, especially since it's a Michigan-based company, it just was appropriate to do an event here. And our guest is the co-editor of this incredible coffee table tome, Herman Miller, A Way of Living. She's also the archivist at Herman Miller. Let's bring her up to the microphone and do this presentation. Please welcome Amy Auscherman. Amy! Thank you for being here, Amy.
Thank you, Martin.
Such a pleasure.
Thanks, Ann Arbor, for coming out on potentially a snow night.
Amy, tell us a little bit about yourself. How long have you been archivist at Herman Miller?
I've been there for about 5 years.
And what's your background? What did you do before?
I worked at an art museum before Herman Miller and went to library school, so I'm technically a library scientist. Do we have any library scientists in the crowd? Maybe.
Tim Grimes. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Woo!
What museum of art did you work at?
The Indianapolis Museum of Art. So I worked with the Miller House and Garden Collection, so you guys are all like design fans. So I worked with the archive that went with the Miller House that was designed by Eero Saarinen. Alexander Girard did the interiors. The Eameses designed the aluminum group for the house. So it was kind of the perfect tee-up to Herman Miller.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How did the idea for this book come about? Whose idea was it to do this Herman Miller Way of Living book? Because there have been many other books about Herman Miller,
There have
correct?
been,
A
yes,
few at least,
there have been books about different aspects of Herman Miller. Somebody in the crowd tonight, Clark Malcolm, knows a lot about that. This was from the business guys. We needed a brand book to really encapsulate all of the stories of the company, the design stories where Herman Miller has been impacted by culture and also impacted culture itself. So it's sort of the first definitive monograph, at least I would say so, that really sort of tells the history of the company from the beginning to now.
Who were the other people you worked with, the other editors in the book?
I worked with 2 amazing editors, one being Sam Graw, who was once the brand director at Herman Miller. He was the editor-in-chief of Dwell magazine before that, so obviously brought a great editorial sense. And then also Leon Ransmeyer, who's an industrial designer, has designed some products for Herman Miller. So 3 people making a book. Very interesting. Don't know if I suggest it, but...
How long did this take? I mean, this thing is massive. It's almost 700 pages.
It took 4 years. So lots of research. I was visiting the U of M library today where we pored over interiors magazines from the 40s. So we really crossed literally the globe. I'll talk about that a bit tonight in the presentation, but obviously Herman Miller has a huge corporate archive I'll give you a peek into. We went to the Vitra Design Museum, Library of Congress, Cooper Hewitt, MoMA. It's amazing. It was amazing to see how much Herman Miller related material lives in the foremost design and art collections all over the world. So it was a chance to really do the nerd work and do a lot of research in reading rooms, and you all probably think that's cool, so this is a good crowd.
I'll sit down and let you do your presentation.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Thank
Amy.
you all. So, like Martin said, this is pretty casual. I'm going to talk a bit about my job at Herman Miller tonight and the process that went into making a 614-page book. So save questions to the end, but I'm happy to have this, be lively. But I'm going to give you a look into what our collection is like. So this is the front door of my office. And I literally manage a warehouse full of business records that include, what you would expect, records from HR, but also what makes it unique is its design drawings, its marketing material, textile samples, furniture itself, films. I wanted to ask, does anybody in here, have you worked for Herman Miller? Raise your hand. Okay, we have a few. Tell me if I get anything wrong, please. How many of you have Herman Miller furniture in your home? Okay, cool. So this is an Eames LTR, which is a great side table, but I'm short, so I like using it as a step stool to get into cabinets. Don't tell OSHA. So like I said, the collection contains multitudes. Some of my favorite parts are correspondence with our most important designers. So I'm sorry if you can't see this, I'll read it. But this is a letter from George Nelson to DJ Dupree, the founder of Herman Miller's company, regarding the acquisition of the Eames furniture and technology and basically the moment when they're bringing Eames in. But what he says is, "Dear Dick, I think you will be interested to know that all competition on the Eames furniture has washed out. Their decision is now between Herman Miller and setting up their new plant." So a little bit of context with that. By 1945, this is when George Nelson had just come on as Herman Miller's design director. The Eameses were already sort of world famous, at least in design circles, for their experiments with molded plywood. George Nelson had come to Herman Miller after a man named Gilbert Rohde had died. Rohde was the first true modern furniture designer that worked for Herman Miller and turned the company from an antique reproduction furniture company to the modern furniture company that most people know it as today. But after Nelson came on, literally within months or probably even weeks, he knew of the work that the Eameses were doing and thought that this seating and technology with 3D molding plywood would be a great ancillary offering to the case goods and sort of meat and potatoes, as I like to call it, that Nelson was designing. But it's amazing to me that having come from an art museum where, of course, you're charged with documenting art and design and artist work, but for a corporate entity to save all of this material over 115 years, which is how old the company is, but to save it, invest in creating collection spaces, and having the foresight to know that this amazing letter from George Nelson is truly like a cornerstone, at least in Herman Miller's design history. And with something like that letter comes the patents that we acquired with acquiring the Eames business. So again, a little bit of background. The Eameses were working with a company called Evans based out of Washington State. They kind of continued the experiments with molded plywood that they were doing for the U.S. Navy and using materials that they were able to get access to during wartime through Evans to continue working on developing chairs. Evans kind of thought maybe after the war they were making the splints and litters that the Eameses had designed that were much better on the battlefield than ones that were made out of metal. But Evans sort of thought after the wartime, maybe we could get into the furniture industry. Well, it was a little bit harder than they thought. And so after the war ended, they started shopping around this Eames business to different companies, one being Knoll. Herman Miller eventually won out after the apocryphal story is Charles and Ray came to Zeeland, Michigan, went to the bakery, liked the bread, and decided that that's who they wanted to work with. I would say, too, Knoll's an amazing design history, obviously, a little bit more European. But I think the Eameses really appreciated the more democratized approach to design that Herman Miller was offering in terms of manufacturing everything locally and it truly being a company that celebrated American design. Clark, you'll recognize this. Clark Malcolm from Herman Miller in the crowd. But one of my favorite collections in the archives is product development kind of collection from a guy named Pep Nagelkirk who ran the model shop at Herman Miller. Basically, Pep was the one charged with trying to bring the designers crazy ideas to life. So he was a great archivist and kept all of these project files for things that happened and didn't happen. So this is a project file for a high-backed coconut chair. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with George Nelson's coconut chair. They kind of toyed with the idea of making it into a lounge chair. That never happened for these reasons. The chair is ugly, it lacks the simplicity and directness of the basic coconut, and looks like an inept modification made by second-rate designers. The chair is uncomfortable. This might be corrected by restudy of the upholstery, but this might involve more thousands of hours on our part and on yours. Obviously this is funny, but it also gives personality to the designers and these people that were working at the time. And in reality, a lot of the correspondence when it comes to product development that I come across now, if any, it's through email, it's through Slack, it's through text messages. So reading how people corresponded so succinctly, but also still were able to maintain a bit of personality is really fun to go through. And if anybody ever comes back to me and thinks, hey, maybe we can make a high-back coconut chair, I'll be like, no, that's not a good idea. Again, orienting you to the collections that we have at Herman Miller, we have a huge 16 millimeter film collection. Charles and Ray Eames were prolific filmmakers as well as furniture designers, exhibition designers, et cetera, et cetera. In their time, they made over 120 films. I think roughly 10 of those were product or sort of exhibition films for Herman Miller. So from my understanding, the Herman Miller Archives sort of at one time acted as a lending library for Eames films. So if you were a salesperson or a student or a researcher, you could write to the Herman Miller Resource Center and we would send you a print of this film. I literally got back from the Library of Congress yesterday, where Herman Miller, I've gotten our business guys and marketing team to funnel money to the Library of Congress, which now holds all of the Eames's working and process material, including all of the source material for these films that they made for Herman Miller. And they've now made preservation copies of these. So meaning they've redone the sound, made new prints, and now we plan to screen those. But people love seeing film canisters because it's old media and it's cool. And I should be a projectionist maybe in the future. We also have a huge photography collection. So if anybody here has worked within the furniture industry, you sort of understand the voluminous material that is created in the marketing process. So whether it is a white sweep of a product, environmental shots, images of events that have happened, but we have a photography collection, which means negatives, prints, slides, that I believe exceeds the 1 million mark in terms of how many things are there. But it is also this great collection of work by prominent designers or photographers. So this image is of Alexander Girard and his wife and business partner, Susan. Girard was the head of Herman Miller's textile division from 1951 to 1972. This is at the opening of Herman Miller's San Francisco showroom that Girard designed for Herman Miller, designed this storage wall. But this was shot by Charles and Ray Eames. So just imagine like these cool mid-century star designers hanging out in the Herman Miller showroom for an opening, and Charles and Ray sort of capturing people interacting, partying, and the space itself. Any art directors or designers, or at least design fans in the crowd, something I like to point out about the way the Eameses were capturing their product at the time was pretty remarkable. So Ray Eames was sort of, she did everything. She had a say in how the furniture looked, how it functioned. She was also an amazing stylist before that was even really considered a profession in terms of being able to art direct a photo shoot or pick the colors or even add something in like some flowers in the corner of the shot. But this shot would have been from the early 50s, and it's not straightforward. It's not in somebody's living room. This sort of begins to get a bit more abstract and looks more sculptural and artistic rather than, people staged using the chairs. It turns the chairs into sculpture and makes it a bit more interesting. Similar to this shot from a photo shoot that probably happened in the late 40s for the molded plywood group that the Eameses designed. But again, this looks more like an assemblage and a mixed media art piece versus people just using the stuff. So I work a lot with our art directors, graphic designers, editorial team now to sort of give them the inspiration to go a little bit further, because that's what sort of made Herman Miller the design leader that it's known as today. And so you look at something like this and it's an assemblage rather than straightforward. And I love it. We also have a group of photography by Ezra Stoller. So again, a crowd who probably some of you know who that is. He was kind of the most famous architectural photographer working at the time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And George Nelson hired him to shoot Herman Miller's 1948 catalog, which was a bound volume, kind of a crazy new way to market furniture to people. But Nelson had this notion that you needed to elevate the furniture and the way you were presenting it to sort of fine art, and also signal to people that the marketing material was just as nice as the product itself. So you get somebody who is, really an artist taking product shots. We have a group of snapshots as well from a guy named Jim Eppinger, who was Herman Miller's first East Coast sales representative. And I mean, in the archive, this is just in a manila envelope. It says Jim Eppinger on it. And if you know who you're looking at, you start to page through it and you see like, oh, well, it appears that Jim Eppinger went and visited Alexander Girard in Santa Fe and got this nice picture of him in his living room with his dog, took photos of the folk art collection that was very voluminous and was also in Girard's home. So it's nice. It's this nice little more human view of the designers and how they lived and worked. This was probably at a raging Holland, Michigan sales conference at one point with Girard, Charles Eames, Ray Eames, George Nelson down in the corner, never without a cigarette. And then you have nice private moments like this. This is Charles and Ray Eames in their house in Pacific Palisades. So again, images that really aren't circulated a lot of these designers, but you just imagine Mr. Eppinger hanging out in their living room and just knowing that it was cool, if only Instagram existed back then. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Herman Miller's famous picnic poster series by Steve Frickholm. Of course, we have those in the archive. But what I also love is images from our company picnics that we still have today. Those have been happening since the 40s, of how Steve's graphics were also applied to ephemera that was handed out at the picnic itself. So Steve's first poster that he did for the Sweet Corn Festival was done in 1971. And then he went on to do 20 more of them. So it's very interesting in terms of these corporate graphics that were kind of just created for the people that worked at Herman Miller. You could take these posters home after the picnic. They ended up all the ones that Steve designed have been acquired into design collections at the Museum of Modern Art, the Cooper Hewitt, the SF MoMA. And I love this notion that design is extended to Herman Miller's employees as well as its customers. But again, these graphics were created for a company-specific, employee-specific event, and then ended up having a life larger than that. Has anyone ever been to the archives? Okay, perfect. Okay, so one person. Sorry if you've seen this before. But I wanted to give a look inside of our vault that we have. So I manage this giant warehouse. It's in the distribution center, so I kind of love being the history that's also tucked within the trucks that actually get the stuff that people buy and gets it to them. So it's very nose to tail. But we have a vault in our collection space that's more climate and humidity controlled, and we keep earlier pieces of furniture in there, as well as photo negatives, some film prints, and marketing material. Here's another view. Those flat files contain design drawings and textiles that you'll also see. We have early examples of some of the Eames furniture, so the fiberglass and both the molded plywood. I get a lot of questions at my job of how to date my furniture, and sometimes it's just as simple as flipping it over and looking at the label. And if you work at Herman Miller long enough, you kind of become known as a chair flipper, because you want to know if it's real or maybe how old it is. This is a label on some of the early Eames's molded plywood furniture. So I mentioned Evans earlier, but from 1947 to 1949, Herman Miller was a distributor of Evans products. So on this, it says manufactured by Evans, distributed by Herman Miller. So if I'm talking to a collector or a researcher, it's sort of like, well, we acquired it in 1949. So likely this label is from a chair from this point in time. We also have tools that were made during the manufacturing process that not only look cool and we lend to museum exhibitions, but we recently reintroduced the fiberglass option for the plastic chairs. It's more environmentally and human friendly now. But this was useful in the product development process to kind of see, measurements, details. We have engineers look at stuff like this, so its life is useful beyond just being a cool object. Another image of boxes that makes me look really organized. And like I said, we have lots of textile samples from Alexander Girard. So like I said, he was the head of our textile division. In his time, he designed over 300 textiles in a multitude of colorways. We retain a lot of these, we use them we have a lot of tours for customers and such at Herman Miller, but Herman Miller now owns a company called Maharam, which is a textile company. They are the producers of Alexander Girard textile designs now, and I work closely with their design and development team when they're thinking about bringing back a new Girard textile or wall covering. And what's unique about our collection is that it can be used. There's a big Girard collection at the Henry Ford in Dearborn, and also at the Cooper Hewitt, but I'm sort of able to lend these samples to my colleagues. I trust them, but it's great for the product development process, and it's a little bit more fast and loose when it comes to collections material. We also have a lot of design and technical drawing. So the Eameses were never ones to, do their own mechanical and technical drawings, but they worked very closely with the Herman Miller Technical Center. So when the Eameses were developing products for Herman Miller, they also thought it was important to figure out how to test them. So Herman Miller developed their technical center / test lab, where you drop 50-pound bags of things into chairs or see what happens if somebody spills something on them. And that was all generated by the Eameses wanting to see how their products would degrade or what they could do to make them better. And then that, therefore, kind of developed this part of the business that also was helping them engineer their products as they were designing them. But then it just leaves us with these amazing source drawings of things like the walnut stool. And it's just cool to see people's notes and thoughts and revisions over the years, which again, from a product development standpoint, helps as we continue to make these things. Herman Miller Research Corporation, which was based here in Ann Arbor, kind of the condensed version. Herman Miller was making and selling residential furniture, obviously into the 50s, but after World War II ended, GI Bill was happening, people were moving into suburbs. They bought all the furniture that they needed for the house. And because the furniture was so great, they weren't needing to buy new stuff. So the business was sort of plateauing. And DJ Dupree, Herman Miller's leader, was sort of thinking about ways to diversify the business and even potentially get out of the furniture business. He met an inventor, as he liked to be called, named Robert Probst in Colorado and convinced him to move to Michigan. He decided on Ann Arbor because it was close to the research that was happening at U of M. But Probst was really into systems. He seems like, if anybody had ever met him, he seems like a guy that thought he could solve any problem, no matter what it was, whether it was feminine hygiene products, clogging toilets, the design of a parking lot, or a cattle branding system. I like to say the feminine hygiene stuff because I was doing research over at the Henry Ford, and Probst literally tried to design a better tampon because at the Herman Miller Research Corporation, it was clogging the toilets, and he thought he could make it better. And being a woman, that's also a design problem that's not really tackled very often by industrial designers because why would you? So I loved coming across that, being very democratic and applying design and problem solving to like a problem that a lot of people have. I don't have that image of the drawing in here tonight, but I do have this little baby cow that looks like he's in pain. But obviously the idea being you brand the cattle, you have these laser vision goggles that you can look out into the field and figure out who they are. But that's not what he got to. He ended up inventing Action Office, which was Herman Miller's systems-based furniture approach to the office space that ended up turning the company into the office furniture company that people know it as today. One of my favorite parts of my job is doing research, obviously, and it's really easy in these sorts of presentations to talk about people like the Eameses and George Nelson and Alexander Gerard, people that have sort of been committed to the canon already. But this is a woman on the left named Tomoko Miho, who is a Japanese-American designer that worked in George Nelson's office and was actually the one doing a lot of the graphic design and environmental work for the Herman Miller account. She designed Herman Miller's 1964 catalog, which you see on the right, that sort of changed the game in the industry in terms of making a catalog that you could continuously update and putting it in the binder, and that's a form that is still used in the industry a lot today. So she was a graphic designer, but she was also an art director. I love the image of the Eames school seating that could otherwise be very boring, and she turns it into sculpture in a way. Her sense of color was also awesome. This is, I think, a 1967 catalog. So again, when I'm working with our designers on staff, I like to show them this type of stuff as inspiration, but also we published a story about Tomoko Miho on Herman Miller's corporate blog a few years ago, just sort of telling her story and getting her to be a name that's committed as part of the Herman Miller design history. We have a huge graphic design and printed matter collection. There was a guy named Irving Harper who worked for George Nelson's office as well, who was the one that designed Herman Miller's logo. So that is an M, not a bikini top, which some people see it as. We have a huge clippings collection. So this is one for the Noguchi coffee table that appeared in an October 1945 issue of The New Yorker. Fortunately, it's glued on the page, but you can still see it. But it's amazing to me as an archivist that at this time, you had people within the company that had the foresight to cut this out of the magazine, paste it on something, and catalog it. More of Irving Harper's work. I had the chance to spend a little time with him before he passed away a few years ago, and he remarked that he loved doing ads for Herman Miller, of which he was assigned about 2 a month for trade publications like Interiors and Arts and Architecture. But he basically could design whatever he wanted, which rendered these amazing, super graphic, abstracted advertisements for furniture. He literally said, I love doing ads for Herman Miller because you could make the furniture as small as you wanted and it still got approved. You also see examples like this where Irving was constantly hanging out at the MoMA and getting inspiration. So obviously, at one point, he went and saw an African masks exhibit and thought that the perfect way to show people the wood species and the furniture pulls that you could specify on the George Nelson Basic Cabinet series was making something that looked like a mask. So those are furniture pulls and then 2 different species of wood that you could use. And then you get examples like this where it's touting Alexander Gerard's textile designs, but it looks like ripped paper. So, I mean, we're constantly advertised to now, whether it be in an email or scrolling through Instagram or Facebook. And it's nice to think about this time when maybe you got something a little bit more artful and less in your face. I like these kind of similar, but I love these advertisements for advertisements, more or less. Very meta. On the left, Alexander Girard designed a binder for his textile collection for Herman Miller that interior designers and specifiers were encouraged to buy. And then on the right, the Eameses weren't done when they were finished designing the piece of furniture. They were designing the ways to sell it as well as manufacture it. So they designed this mobile that retailers of Herman Miller furniture were encouraged to buy and make more sales. All of the designers who worked for Herman Miller, at least from the 40s through the 60s, again, were designing the furniture, but also the marketing materials as well. So this was a poster that was sent out to celebrate the opening of Herman Miller's San Francisco showroom. And all of the hand lettering and typography was done by Alexander Girard. Really, the brand standards that were used sort of at this point in time was you just had to have the name and the M, at least. You could do whatever typeface you wanted. That's very different now. This was a mailer that was designed by Deborah Sussman, who was a graphic designer that worked for both the Eames office and Alexander Girard. So imagine just getting this beautiful screen printed piece in the mail, encouraging you to buy textiles or folk art objects. I wanted to talk a little bit too about how the archives are actively used in the business every day. A few years ago, Herman Miller acquired Design Within Reach. Obviously, they're more geared towards residential furniture. And they came to Herman Miller and said, we need a new bed in the line. Is there anything we could bring back? And what you see here are advertisements for George Nelson's thin edge bed. We were able to pull the original design drawings for this product for DWR's product development team to reference. They also brought back the daybed. But again, just giving you the sense of these materials are still very relevant and used. On the left, you see the original sort of spec drawing for the thin edge bed with the cane headboard. And then on the right is our new product photography for the thin edge bed. And then same with the daybed. So again, just showing you how it's used. And then at the end of the process, so it's again nose to tail, when we are looking to advertise this new line of furniture in somewhere like the Wall Street Journal, they're usually coming to me and asking, do you have any old pictures of George Nelson or the furniture being used? So all to say that our assets are used constantly for all different things, whether it be press or an Instagram post. And now to this giant tome of which we are all here to celebrate. I started at Herman Miller about 5 years ago, and this project came across my desk, kind of one of the first things that I was tasked with helping to do, which as an archivist and a design fan was great because it allowed me to deep dive into Herman Miller's own collection and really understand what was there and also understand what is in collections around the world. And so the way that the book is structured, it's 10 chapters, and they're all sort of framing what we called impact moments in Herman Miller history. So I mentioned Gilbert Rohde earlier, but that's chapter 1. That is the point when Herman Miller is becoming a modern furniture company. Chapter 4 is about the Herman Miller collection catalog, which I mentioned earlier. Ezra Stoller did the product photography, and it was a catalog that was actually sold to people, which no one had ever done before, and it sort of ended up shifting how the industry approached product photography, how they were marketing their pieces. This is a spread from that chapter that's talking about how Herman Miller was applying environmental graphics, both in actual printed matter and then in spaces itself. So after Irving Harper designed this logo, we were putting it in spaces like our New York showroom or a showroom in the Merchandise Mart. And the Eameses and the Nelson office were able to do this sort of environmental design and wayfinding that also connected back to the catalog. So they were really good at kind of creating this through line for people that were experiencing the furniture both on page and in the space itself. A bit of the research process. I mean, everything on this page basically came from different research collections, whether it is the Chicago History Museum that has a collection of interiors from the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, or the Library of Congress, where there's a slide from the Eames collection where they're installing and taking pictures, the Vitra Design Museum, Herman Miller's own. Actually, the ad or the article that's on the lower right, I came to the University of Michigan Art and Design Library to pore through architectural forum issues that they have to find this little piece of an article about George Nelson partnering with a company called Lock Leg, which is making those hairpin legs that they were including. So that was from Ann Arbor. Came here, spent a whole day, and I found it, and it was like one of the best feelings. The book was also a chance to sort of showcase all of this graphic and general design work that was happening at the company, not only obviously in the products, but with how we were selling it as well. So all of these pamphlets were done via the Nelson office, as well as the ad on the right. But again, I mean, I see this stuff every day, but most people don't, and it's really cool to see it all together and gain an understanding of what the graphic expressions have been of the company over the years and how inspiring they've been. For true nerds, we also reprinted a lot of primary source material in the book as well. So there's over 2,000 images in the book. Each chapter is sort of prefaced with about a 2,000-word essay, so it's not as rigorous as at least it appears. But again, in the research process, we were able to encounter so much of this primary source material, including an article in a publication called Furniture Forum, which was like a trade catalog introducing people to new designs at mid-century. And then they would also get people like Alexander Girard to write personal essays like Good Design versus Style. So we borrowed that from a collector to photograph. Herman Miller had like a transcript copy of the article in the archive, and we reprinted it in the book. So if people are Girard fans, they can read writing by him, not by me. I wasn't there. We also we do our best to tie the company's history to how we're approaching business now. This is a spread of photography from Herman Miller's latest retail venture in New York City. We have what we call our flagship at 251 Park Avenue South. The building was George Nelson's office, last place that they resided, so it has this nice history. But if you look at the layout of the store, I helped source some vintage furniture pieces for the layout and the design, but I was working with our 3D designers, showing them how people like Alexander Girard and George Nelson and the Eameses approached merchandising and showroom design to kind of inspire them to how to approach the space now. But these photos are from just a few years ago, but it's within the chapter that talks about Alexander Girard and his retail space he designed for Herman Miller. Again, research process. So I mentioned the Library of Congress. This is a door to the Prints and Photographs reading room at the Library of Congress. I love the icon. You do, in fact, have to get a library card to do research at the Library of Congress. It was one of my proudest moments as somebody who went to library school. And then the way this is like deep nerdery, but the way that the collection is divided is between the prints and photographs, the manuscripts, and the motion picture division, because the Eameses were constantly creating and made all this material. So much, so over 1 million items went to the Library of Congress. And so on the left, you have a manuscript box, stuff in there is correspondence, etc. On the right is a box for the slide collection that the Eameses kept, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands. So you see the call number on the right. So HM denotes product photography or showroom photography that they were doing for Herman Miller that we just literally poured through to find color, things that were in color, which it's hard to get from that time period. But again, in the manuscripts division, you get stuff like this, hand-drawn instructions for assembly hardware for the fiberglass chairs that ostensibly would have been sent on to the Herman Miller marketing team to include in a brochure or at least some sort of instructional material for our sales team. You also get moments like this where I love to talk about Ray Eames and how much she was doing in the office, because sometimes that's disputed, but she truly was sort of a final consultant on everything that went out the door, whether it was a piece of furniture or an invite to a Herman Miller showroom presentation. So Ray was also doing like color work, but also graphic design. This is a sort of mock-up for a showroom invitation where she's doing her amazing hand-done typography and also kind of an experiment of what sort of colors to use on what would eventually be this printed piece. The Eameses also kept press about themselves. Saul Steinberg was an illustrator for The New Yorker and also a friend of the Eameses, and came by in their studio in Venice shortly after they developed the fiberglass chairs and did some sketches on early prototypes. But this says, want, sitting nude, kicked out of show, controversy over drawing on plastic chair. Is it vulgar or is it art? So I love that they kept this about themselves. Some of the more surreal moments of the collection are going through basically the contents of Ray Eames's office. She was a color master. She had a huge decorative paper collection. So this was a moment in time where I opened up a folder and it was literally just scraps of paper, which initially you're like, why is this in here? But then you look at it and you're like, oh, all of these colors go so well together that I'm sure this informed some project that she was working on, that in the 80s when they were packing up their office, they thought, oh, let's save that. There's a lot of stuff in there, matchbooks, business cards, notes on napkins. Makes me feel better about all the stuff that I save in my life. And then one moment that you get in the slide collection, this is Ray Eames hanging out at their house that they built and designed in the late 40s in Pacific Palisades. This is probably in the late 70s. But the slide collection that we worked with, again, it's projects that they were working on, but also personal moments, vacations they were taking. One of my favorite slides that I came across, which I am telling you about it, but it's not in here, was literally George Nelson and Buckminster Fuller hanging out in Atlantic City, swimming in the ocean. So just imagine that crew of people hanging out in Atlantic City.
Let's hear it for Amy Auscherman. Great presentation.
Thank you.
This program was recorded on January 17th, 2020 at the Ann Arbor District Library.